Hello and welcome to a new video. My name is Gracie and today I'm going to be doing a bit of a tutorial on how to make a basic gathered skirt. And this is one of the most useful things you can make, especially if you are doing modern sewing, vintage sewing, historical sewing. I'm sure it has uses in cosplay. I don't do very much cosplay, so I'm not super knowledgeable about that. But this is a good way to create a very easy to make skirt that has a lot of fullness. So do you want to do something that's like from the mid 19th century and has a big poofy skirt? This is what you want to do. It's also not dissimilar from how 18th century petticoats are constructed. And it's also popular if you want to wear this kind of skirt over one of those floofy crinolines for a 1950s style look, or you could just wear it modern today and it looks really cute. All that to say, this skirt is super useful and it is a good tool to have in your toolbox as you're learning to sew. I'm going to be constructing my skirt with a mixture of hand and machine techniques, but throughout this video I'm going to be discussing where you can use machine if I'm using hand sewing, or where you can use your hand sewing if I'm using the machine, because this skirt could be constructed entirely by hand or entirely by machine. So if you're a new sewist, I don't know what word we were using. If you're new to sewing, you could do this entirely by hand and you'll come up with a great skirt even if you don't yet have a machine. And if you don't like hand sewing, or if it gives you hand pain, you could also make this with a machine and you'll have something that looks great too. I am using a linen, but this skirt works well in pretty much any fabric that gathers well and has nice shape. I would avoid making it from a knit fabric because that will have some stretch and will mess up your waistband, but you could do this from a worsted wool or a quilting cotton. Though quilting cottons are kind of iffy because their texture is not always very nice. They wrinkle really easily, but if you want to make something out of a quilting cotton, you could do that. You could do this out of an old bed sheet. You could do this out of linen like I'm doing. This is a very versatile project and it is a good first garment if you've never made clothes before and you want something that will look nice but is not that difficult to make. Feel free to ask below if you need anything clarified, and with that, let us get to the fabric. The first step to make this skirt is to measure your waist. To do this, you can tie a string around the narrowest point of your body between your hips and your rib cage, also known as your natural waist. I recommend using a string for this measurement rather than a measuring tape, because you won't have to lean over to look at the number and you can actually alter your waist measurement by leaning. I used this string to mark out my waistband on the fabric. The string's length plus 2 inches for seam allowance and overlap are equal to the measurement of my waistband piece. I measured out the height of the waistband as well before cutting. For a 1-inch wide waistband, I cut 2 2-inch wide strips, leaving room for seam allowance on the top and bottom. Each waistband piece was then cut along the straight of grain of the fabric, closely following a single thread, but you could also mark your cut lines with a pen or pencil. Next, I cut out the panels of the skirt, 2 rectangles the width of my fabric and the length that I wanted my skirt to be. The first step in constructing the skirt was stitching the 2 skirt panels together. If your skirt only has 1 gathered panel, you don't have to do this, but my skirt had 2 panels with a seam at the center back. I stitched this seam with a French seam for extra security against fraying, but if you are hand sewing your skirt, you could use a simple seam and a running stitch, or for extra strength, you could make a felled seam here. Next, I folded the center front edges of my skirt panel under twice, creating a placket that will eventually serve as the button closure. The center front edges were secured with running stitches in white linen thread. This seam could also easily be done on the machine or with whip stitches for a more invisible seam, but I wanted the homemade appearance of a row of running stitches. Next, I stitched the hem. Like the center front edge, this was a double folded hem, but instead of ironing the first fold in place, I basted it down. For longer hems, I prefer basting the first fold in place because I find it more precise than ironing. After basting, the hem was folded over again and stitched in place with a running stitch. Like with the center front edge, the hem could also be sewn on a sewing machine or with a whip stitch. Once the large rectangle that would become the skirt was hemmed, I decided to add the pockets. Adding pockets before pleating or gathering a skirt is much easier than adding pockets after the skirt is gathered to a waistband, especially for patch pockets like these. For my pocket, I cut 2 squares with a triangle cut from the top, and then I used that as a template to cut out a facing in contrasting white linen for the top edge of the pocket. The pocket facing was stitched to the top edge of the pocket, and then it was folded over so that the contrast was visible on the exterior of the pocket. The facing was carefully pinned down, though basting would have been more precise here. The lower edge of the contrast facing was folded under and stitched in place, and then a matching row of stitching was added around the top edge of the pocket. Next, I pinned the pocket to my skirt, using a ruler to make sure that my pockets would be symmetrical on either side. If you don't want to do such a complex pocket with contrast facing, a simple square with a hem at the top edge works just as well. I just wanted to add some interest to an otherwise plain skirt with these pockets. I sewed around the edge of the pocket, securing it to the skirt with spaced back stitches for extra strength, though you could also use a simple straight stitch on the machine for this step. I was especially careful at the top corners of the pockets, which can be extra finicky and are liable to tear if not properly secured to the fabric. Once the pockets were made and attached, the next step was to make a waistband. I first made a tube from a long strip of scrap fabric, and once the tube was turned inside in, I had material to make coordinating belt loops to attach to the waistband. The belt loop tube was cut into short segments, and each segment was pinned to the waistband until I had something that looked like the belt loops on a pair of pants. The second layer of the waistband, essentially the lining, was pinned to the first, sandwiching the belt loops between 2 layers of fabric. The top edge of the waistband was stitched down, securing the tops of the belt loops, and I carefully stitched over the belt loops on the lower edge of one side of the waistband. This will simplify the process when I attach the skirt to the waistband. The last step in preparing the waistband was flattening the seam I had sewn so that it would lay nicely once the skirt was finished, and folding in the edges of the waistband that will abut the front closures. Once the waistband was prepared, it was time to gather the skirt so it could be secured to the waistband. Unless I am concerned about historical technique or extreme precision, my preferred method of gathering for modern garments is running 2 rows of parallel stitches at the maximum stitch length on the sewing machine. I did 1 row of stitches a 1/4 inch from the top edge of the fabric, and a second row about a 1/4 inch below that. To make gathering easier, I added gathering stitches to each panel separately, so I will be able to gather the panels individually. When I gather fabric, I like to anchor my gathering threads at one end by wrapping them around a pin in a figure of 8. Then, the free ends of the gathering thread are pulled and the fabric stacks up against the threads in neat gathers. Making the gathers even takes practice, but if you fiddle with them for a few minutes, you should get the hang of it, and you will end up with a neatly gathered panel. Next, I pinned the waistband to the gathered portion of the skirt. I aligned the center back of the waistband with the center back of the skirt, and I pinned it such that the exterior of the skirt was facing towards the belt loops on the waistband. You may have to do a bit more fiddling with the gathers to get them to fit to the waistband. I stitched the waistband to the gathered skirt with the gathers on the bottom towards the feed dogs of the machine. Hand sewing gathers in place with a whip stitch or a back stitch is more precise and will result in neater gathers, but I chose to machine sew my gathers to my waistband for speed. Once the gathered skirt panel was attached to the waistband, I folded the lining of the waistband over and pinned along the top edge before pinning the waistband lining to the gathers on the interior, enclosing the gathered edge and securing down the waistband lining with one seam. The edge of the waistband lining was secured with whip stitches. While this could be done by machine, I recommend using whip stitches as it is difficult for me to ensure that my machine stitches are straight and that I catch the waistband lining while sewing this kind of seam by machine. With the skirt secured to its waistband, my last step was to add buttons and buttonholes. I used a ruler to mark the placement of my buttonholes along the front edge of the skirt. Each buttonhole was measured such that it would be the right size for the buttons I had chosen, and I used small scissors to cut open the buttonholes before stitching them. Ordinarily, I would machine sew these buttonholes, as I find it to be more precise and much faster, but the buttonhole function on the machine that I'm using isn't working, so I hand sewed mine. Once the buttonholes were stitched, I used a pencil to mark the placement of each corresponding button. I chose engraved shell buttons for this skirt, and I think they're quite cute. Once the buttons were all stitched on, the skirt was complete. Thank you for watching, and if you have any questions about this process, don't hesitate to leave a comment. I hope you have a nice rest of your day.